There's a moment in every man's life when something inside him quietly snaps, but no one around him notices. If you're feeling it, this video might explain why. You can always tell when a man's life is starting to drift off course, but it never happens the way movies teach us to expect. There's no explosion, no cinematic meltdown, no dramatic declaration that everything has fallen apart. Instead, it begins in silence. In the small, private corners of his mind where no one else has access. A slow irritation he can't name. A sense that each day is somehow a repeat of the one before. A heaviness in his eyes when he wakes up, as if he already lived this moment too many times. He looks at the life he has, whether he built it or simply inherited it, and realizes it doesn't feel like his anymore. It runs, but not for him. It continues, but not because he's choosing it. Something inside begins to resist, quietly but firmly, like an engine refusing to keep running on the wrong fuel. Every man eventually arrives at this inner crossroads, though few ever admit it out loud. The version of himself he's been presenting to the world begins to lose its shape. It no longer fits. It no longer protects. It no longer feels true. So he keeps going. He goes to work. He comes home. He smiles when he's supposed to. He performs the roles expected of him. But if you look closely, something in his posture betrays the truth. He has outgrown the life he's living. And strangely, almost no one notices. People see routines, not ruptures. They interpret silence as stability. They assume he's fine because he's functional. But inside, the ground is shifting. The instincts he buried years ago, the ones he silenced to survive, to impress, to avoid conflict, begin to wake up. They don't return with chaos. They return with clarity. And clarity is uncomfortable. It cuts through excuses he's relied on for years. It exposes all the small compromises that gradually tightened his life into something he can barely breathe in. A man can fool others with surprising skill, but his own psyche? Never. It knows when he's living beneath his potential. It knows when he traded purpose for predictability. It knows when he's performing masculinity instead of embodying it. Most men feel this shift long before they have the courage to acknowledge it. So they drown it in work. They numb it with distractions. They negotiate with it by telling themselves they'll make changes later, when things slow down, when money improves, when the timing is right. But the timing never becomes right. And the deeper self does not negotiate. A man who ignores himself becomes a stranger in his own life. So if you feel that quiet agitation right now, the restlessness, the suspicion that you were meant for something larger than the life you settled into, understand this. That feeling is not failure. It's the first signal that your inner architecture is preparing to rebuild itself. Something in you is ready to grow, and it will break anything that tries to hold it in place. Thinkers like Jung understood this clearly. Growth rarely begins in moments of comfort. It begins when an ancient part of a man refuses to remain stagnant. Not the polite, well-adjusted version of him, but the sovereign one. The inner self that remembers he wasn't born to exist on autopilot. The part that knows every man eventually reaches a threshold he must cross if he wants his life to belong to him instead of to expectations. And when this threshold appears, it doesn't arrive with trumpets or warnings. It arrives through dissatisfaction, through the sudden realization that praise doesn't nourish you, that stability doesn't inspire you, that the roles you've mastered don't spark any sense of vitality. This isn't depression. It's not emptiness. It's your psyche removing everything that no longer serves the next version of you. If you feel it, you're not collapsing. You're being summoned. Summoned toward a life that requires more intelligence, more presence, more self-respect than the one you've been tolerating. Summoned toward a version of manhood that can't be inherited or copied. It must be forged through your own confrontation with yourself. This is where the real initiation begins. Not when a man succeeds, but when he can't bear the weight of a life that no longer aligns with his inner world. There comes a moment, quiet, subtle, but unmistakable, when a man realizes he can't keep hiding inside his own habits. He starts to see that the routines he once relied on don't protect him anymore. They confine him. They give structure, yes, but they also shrink his range of experience until he can't stretch, can't test himself, can't feel alive. He sees that the life he built was shaped more by obedience than by vision. And this recognition disrupts the story he's been telling himself about who he is. Most men like to believe they are rational, deliberate, self-directed. But in reality, many simply follow the blueprint handed to them. Get stable, stay consistent, avoid risks, don't ask too many questions. But stability, without meaning, slowly erodes the self. A man eventually discovers that he didn't fail. He simply hasn't begun. Once a man becomes aware of this, he can't go back to sleep. He may try. He may drown the awareness with productivity, entertainment, or relationships that help him avoid confronting himself. But the truth resurfaces in subtle ways. The heaviness while driving home, the irritation when someone tells him he should be grateful, the boredom where excitement used to live. These aren't random emotions. They are directives. Signals from the deeper masculine layers within him. The king demanding purpose. The warrior demanding challenge. The magician demanding clarity. The lover demanding vitality. When these archetypes awaken, a man can no longer live as he did. He must expand, or he will decay. And the most dangerous thing that can happen to a man isn't misfortune. It's comfort without fulfillment. Comfort seduces him into shrinking. It gives him just enough stability to stay predictable, but not enough meaning to feel alive. Comfort becomes a slow form of decay. People around him misinterpret this shift too. When he grows quieter, they assume he's tired. When he withdraws, they think he's disinterested. When his patience shortens, they label him irritable. But those who understand men recognize what's unfolding. He's dismantling the life he built without intention. Seeking the fractured lines. Preparing to rebuild from something truer. This reconstruction begins internally long before any external change. A man begins questioning commitments he made before he truly knew himself. Promises made out of fear rather than desire. Agreements made to avoid conflict rather than to honor his path. He notices how often he dimmed himself to keep others comfortable. How often he pretended not to want more. How often he suppressed his own direction so he wouldn't disrupt anyone else's expectations. This is not failure. This is awakening. It is the magician within him starting to see through illusions. And when that happens, the old version of him begins to fall apart, not from weakness, but because it no longer fits the size of the man he's becoming. When this inner shift begins, people assume a man is drifting or distracted, but the truth is far more precise. He is shedding. He is letting go of a persona that no longer serves him, not because he wants chaos, but because the scaffolding that once held his life together can't support the weight of who he is becoming. A man is not meant to remain who he was at 25. He is meant to evolve into someone with sharper instincts, deeper insight, and a clearer sense of direction. But that transformation only begins when he confronts the stagnation he's ignored for years. And that confrontation isn't comfortable, it's clarifying. The moment a man admits to himself that he has outgrown the life he built, the ground shifts beneath him. Uncertainty rises, but so does possibility. Anxiety appears, but alongside it, instinct awakens. He loses the familiarity of his old life, but gains something far more important, his internal authority. This is the first real taste of sovereignty. Because the real transformation begins when a man stops asking how to fix what's breaking and starts asking what needs to be built in its place. And that question will reshape him more than any achievement ever could. What surprises most men at this stage is that the hardest part isn't dissatisfaction, it's honesty. It's the courage to look at his life without filters. to admit that many of his choices weren't choices at all. They were reactions. Attempts to be agreeable, reliable, predictable. Qualities the world rewards. Yet qualities that can shrink a man if they become his identity instead of tools he uses intentionally. When he finally notices that he has been living smaller than the man he feels inside, a new tension forms. Not a crisis, but a quiet rift in the psyche. Something inside him refuses to stay domesticated. He may not talk about it, but he feels it in the micro moments. When he hesitates before making a decision, when he postpones ambitions that once thrilled him, when he catches himself searching for permission to make choices that should already be his. This resistance always begins with questions he never dared to ask. How did I end up here? Why does every week feel like a repeat? Where did my instinct go? And what would my life look like if I stopped negotiating with myself? These questions aren't signs of confusion. They're proof the inner observer, the magician, is fully awake. And once it wakes, it starts noticing everything. How often he silenced his own judgment to avoid tension. How often he said yes to maintain harmony. How often he accepted expectations that were never aligned with his deeper values. This is a tectonic shift. It makes no sound, but it rearranges his entire foundation. A man in this stage stands between two forces. One part wants to preserve the life he built. The other is ready to burn it down and rebuild from something authentic. He must decipher which voice is fear and which is truth. And this isn't easy, because fear doesn't always scream. Most often, it whispers. Fear is strategic. Fear is subtle. Fear tells him that later is safer than now. Fear convinces him that the life he has is good enough. And nearly every man thinks he's immune to this form of fear, until the moment he confronts something he genuinely wants. Because ambition exposes timidity. Desire exposes hesitation. Purpose exposes avoidance. Fear grows loudest right before a breakthrough. Not because he's moving in the wrong direction, but because the ego is terrified of losing its familiar landscape. The ego would prefer unhappiness and predictability over the risk of discovering who he truly is. This is where the warrior becomes essential, not the aggressive caricature of masculinity, but the part of a man that refuses paralysis. The warrior doesn't eliminate fear. It strips fear of its authority. It understands that fear isn't a barrier, it's a signal. A sign that the next chapter will demand more from him than the last. The warrior steps toward the resistance, not away from it. And when this energy awakens, something shifts. His language becomes clearer. His posture steadier. He becomes less apologetic, more intentional. He starts choosing what strengthens him rather than what soothes him. He begins releasing obligations that once felt sacred, but were actually shaping him into someone he didn't want to become. This unsettles the world around him. People question why he has changed, as if change is a violation. They challenge his decisions, as if his previous compliance was the standard. They try to escort him back into the versions of himself that were convenient for them. But a man who has looked directly at his fear can no longer return to being manageable. He becomes grounded in a way that makes manipulation ineffective. He stops responding to guilt. He stops bending to expectations. He begins to see through dynamics that once controlled him. And because he now understands the mechanics of how he kept himself small, he becomes nearly impossible to influence without his consent. This clarity is not arrogance. It's alignment. It's the magician and the warrior working together, forming a new psychological center. Fear doesn't disappear, but it becomes a compass. Wherever the resistance is strongest, that is usually where his growth is waiting. When a man reaches this point, he no longer asks, "Should I change?" The real question becomes, "What must I dismantle first?" Some dismantling will be external. Habits, environments, obligations that dilute his ambition. But the most essential dismantling happens internally. He must confront the beliefs he accepted without questioning. The roles he outgrew but still performs. The relationships he maintained out of politeness instead of truth. The identities he clings to because they make other people comfortable. This is not rebellion. This is reclamation. And when a man reaches this stage, he discovers something most people never understand. Fear was never trying to stop him. Fear was trying to initiate him. Fear is a threshold guardian, not an enemy. It demands proof that a man is serious before allowing him to cross into a new life. It wants to know whether he will choose the familiar or the real. His answer is revealed not in words, but in movement. A man knows he is crossing that threshold when he stops pretending to be confused. When he stops delaying decisions he already knows he must make. When he stops outsourcing his direction to people who aren't responsible for the outcome of his life. Doubt dissolves not because everything becomes clear, but because he becomes unwilling to remain where he's been. At this point, he no longer tries to rebuild the old life. He begins constructing something new, something aligned, something that fits the magnitude of the man he knows himself to be. And that is the true beginning, not of collapse, but of sovereignty. When a man stops negotiating with his potential, he becomes someone different. Not louder, not harsher, just undeniably grounded. He speaks less but means more. He moves slower but with intention. He stops performing confidence and starts living with purpose. He stops waiting for permission, because no one can authorize a man to become himself. That authority must be claimed from within. And if this message shook something awake in you, if it made you recognize the gap between the life you tolerate and the life you want, then don't ignore that signal. It's your initiation. It's your beginning. It's the moment your life starts to shift from inherited to chosen. If this video reshaped your thinking, make sure to like, share, and subscribe. And if you want to support the channel, you'll find the link in the description. If something in this video spoke to you, drop a comment and share your thoughts. Hit like, and make sure to follow for more deep conversations like this.